Well, after a wild week of college football, there was some movement in the AP. You saw Alabama take over the top spot after beating Georgia, which is already being called the game of the year. Our Brandon Marcello agreed. The Tide also take the top spot in his college football power rankings, followed by a Texas squad who coasted past Mississippi State with Arch Manning behind center. Georgia falling to number 5. Ole Miss out of the top 10. Also some movement as well for UNLV. Matt Sluka-less out. They're in the top 25 is the point that I'm trying to make there, UNLV. Got a little ahead of myself there. Let's go ahead and bring in our 24/7 Sports national college football reporter, Brandon Marcello. We also have Danny Kanell, our college football analyst, to talk about this list. Brandon, we're going to start at number 1. Alabama, the consensus number 1 spot, both in the AP and your rankings. The money I would have paid to be at Bryant-Denny on Saturday night. What a game. What made you push the Tide to the number 1 spot this week?
Yeah, I had a difficult time between them and Texas, right? And, of course, I had to look at Alabama and their schedule. Going on the road against Wisconsin, beating them compared to, obviously, Texas's big win at Michigan. Texas gets the edge there, but Alabama obviously gets the edge, beating a top 2 Georgia team. I had Georgia at number 1 entering this past week. So Alabama gets to go in. They jump up to number 1 in my eyes. An incredible start to that game, as we all know. I could not believe what I was seeing there with Jalen Milroe and crew. 3 explosive plays in the first 10 plays of the game against a Georgia defense that hadn't allowed more than 2 all season, and yet they were able to do that. Had to hang on there in the second half, as we all know and we all saw. I do have some questions about Alabama still, especially defensively in that second half. Some of those issues that we saw against South Florida earlier this season popped up once again, but the Tide for now deserve the number 1 spot.
See, I am on the other side of this. I'm going to take Texas. And you compared a win against Wisconsin with the wins against Michigan. I would say the win against Michigan you compare to the win against Georgia. Michigan is currently a top 10 team according to the AP top 25, and Georgia's not going anywhere. I understand that. But what is more impressive? A game that you squeaked by, potentially almost gave up that big win at home in your backyard, or completely dominating a really good Michigan team on the road. Like I said, though, I'm not going to fight anybody on this one. I totally get it with Alabama. The emergence of Jalen Milroe with Kalen DeBoer has done a phenomenal job getting him up to speed in this system, which is new. It is different. Utilizing his abilities as a runner, which we already knew about, but developing him to a top-tier passer makes Alabama one of the best teams in the country. But, oh, by the way, with Texas, don't forget, they've got a couple of wins without their starting quarterback in Arch Manning, which was impressive as anybody. I don't know how many teams in the country could say that. Alabama, Texas, I think you're splitting hairs. Either way, they're both phenomenal.
Yeah, they're both really good programs, so I'm with you there. Arch Manning, what he was able to do against Mississippi State in that start was impressive, too. I did want to mention with Georgia, about 8 different streaks were snapped with that loss. The most important one that I wrote down, they hadn't allowed a touchdown in 4 games. They obviously allowed 4 in that first half, so crazy stuff there. Let's talk about a team that slid out of the top 10. Of course, that is Ole Miss. You were on the post-game reaction show when Kentucky took them down. I feel like, though, guys, we do this every year because you have them right now, Brandon, at number 12 in your list. The AP has them at 15. But when it comes to Lane Kiffin and the Rebels, I feel like we do this every year where we put them up there in the top 5, and they're this great offensive team. And then there kind of hits this point where we're at right now where they get a big loss, and then we kind of reevaluate how we think about Ole Miss as a contender, whether it's college football playoffs in the SEC, etc. Brandon, walk us through your thought process here of having them at that number 12 spot, and are they truly one of the top teams in the country?
Well, I dropped them to 15, actually. I was not very impressed at all, obviously, with them and what they did against Kentucky. They could not get on the field and on third downs. They could not continue drives. Jackson Dart struggled. And then defensively, they kind of just fell into Kentucky's trap. Kentucky wants to play ball control. They were able to do that against Georgia a little bit a couple weeks ago. And then they were able to do that on the road at Ole Miss. And listen, Lane Kiffin's big issue throughout his career is just that he's all flash and no substance. Where are these big wins? Where are you going to beat these big-time programs? And then he stubs his toe against Kentucky. And as some of the other also rans in the SEC in previous seasons. Yes, winning 9-10 games at Ole Miss is incredible, but he's got a special roster. This is supposed to be the year where they win 11-12 games, get into the playoff, make some noise, maybe get to the SEC championship game. You cannot afford to lose at home to Kentucky. The first time a top 10 Ole Miss team has lost to an unranked team at home since 1970. historically bad loss for the Rebels. Kentucky's defense is good to great, but you don't lose home, especially when your offense is scoring 55 points a game and you muster only 17.
This was an embarrassingly bad loss for Ole Miss, Brandon. Totally agree with you. I probably would have dropped them a little bit further because once you start diving deeper on their resume, it's like, okay, who have they beaten? And they've beaten a bunch of nobodies. Wake Forest is probably their most impressive win, but because it was on the road and it was against a Power 4 opponent. But Wake Forest has really been struggling this season. Then it's a mismatch of kind of also rans that are Group of 5 opponents and an FCS opponent in Furman who they beat up on. The thing that would be most concerning to me, and you nailed it, is this has become a trend with Lane Kiffin. You know, they talk big game, and he's great on social media, and he's control better than anybody in the history of in college football, maybe outside of Steve Spurrier. But even go back to the get your popcorn ready right before that Bama game. Then he goes out there and gets smoked against Bama. This offseason has been a ton of fun. A week ago, he's making TikToks with his daughter, which is a girl dad. I love it. But at some point, like, where's the focus? Where's the intensity when you got pushed around by a team you were favored to beat by 2 touchdowns? Physically, they were weak. At quarterback, they were weak. And I think mentally, they were weak. It's a cause for concern for Ole Miss fans.
Yeah, that's what our Damian Harris said after the game as well. He called out Lane Kiffin and Jackson Dart specifically on getting the ship back on the right track. Let's talk about a couple other teams that are improving. Indiana and BYU moving to 5-0 after a couple of big statement wins this weekend. Brandon, you have them at 16 and 19 respectfully there. What stood out to you about these two teams and their wins?
Indiana just gets it done. They score points in bunches. They beat Maryland 42-28. But you know what was so impressive about this game? They scored 21 unanswered. They overcame 4 turnovers to win a Big Ten game by double digits. Curt Cignetti's got that thing rolling. They're averaging more than 26 points more a game than they were last season. He's turned things around. The schedule's about to get a little bit more difficult after they play Northwestern this week. But how can you not love Indiana? They just score points in bunches, no matter the opponent and no matter the amount of turnovers they have in games. Really impressive. And then BYU building off that big win against Kansas State, really getting rolling on the road at Baylor. They had to hold off a fierce comeback attempt by Baylor, but I'll tell you what, BYU's defense really stepped up there in the fourth quarter, especially those final 3 possessions. Watching them on tape, BYU sneaky good this year. They win a bunch of different ways. I'm very interested to see how they deal with maybe some closer battles coming up in the Big 12, because as we've seen this past week, the Big 12, close matchups. 7 matchups this past week were decided by 1 possession, and that's what we expected in the Big 12 this season. But credit to BYU for still being undefeated.
These are 2 of the best stories of college football early this season. The surprising success that both of these had. BYU, Kalani Sitake, a little bit on the hot seat, even though he's one of the most well-liked coaches out there. They expect to win 8, 9, 10 games, and this season they are off to a phenomenal start. And I think there's still some lack of belief in BYU, as evidenced by the point spread going to Baylor. They were a 3-point underdog, but they were underdogs against Kansas State as well. They keep proving the odds makers incorrect. They'll start winning them over. I do think they have a tougher road ahead of them in an extremely competitive Big 12, where I would expect them probably to slip up a couple times on the way to the finish. What's really interesting is Indiana, I would not say the same about. There is a very good chance they could be 9-0 before they play Michigan at home and then Ohio State on the road. And we had a very hearty debate today on the Cover 3 podcast. Go give it a listen about if, let's say they beat Michigan at home and they lose to Ohio State on the road and they finish 11-1, is Indiana a playoff team? I said yes, emphatically. It's a Big Ten team, but their schedule is set up where there's not those impressive resume-building wins. So it's going to be something really special to watch out for if they continue on this special season. Curtis Rourke, the transfer from Ohio from the MAC, has been an outstanding find for Curt Cignetti. They're playing with a ton of confidence. This is a story absolutely to keep an eye on. I think there's longevity. BYU, I love it. It's a great story. I don't know how long it lasts. Indiana, I think we'll be talking about November, which is something I don't think anybody would have thought in August.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Are you pinning them as a conference champion contender, maybe?
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
Because they do play Ohio State and Michigan, who I do think are another tier. But again, they play Michigan at home. Michigan has no offense. Like, all of a sudden, with this high-powered Indiana offense, if they put up, 21, 24 points. That could be a massive challenge for Michigan to have to deal with, who almost lost and blew a lead to Minnesota. So I think it's much more wide open. I do think Oregon, Ohio State, probably USC I would have above them. But if things fall the right way, all of a sudden we could be talking about. And if there are 4 teams that get in from the Big Ten, which I think that's probably an acceptable number, why couldn't it be Indiana?
Rooting for chaos over here on CBS Sports HQ. Someone who is not rooting for chaos is Utah. However, they're on the backside of this ranking. Brandon, you have the number 24 after that loss to Arizona. 31-game home winning streak was snapped. I believe now that they've lost only 3 games in their last 36. So obviously from a streak standpoint, that's not what you want to see. But you still kept them up there in your top 25. Why is Utah still hanging on to a spot here in your power rankings?
Yeah, they tumbled the worst here. 16 spots in my rankings here. They are just a completely different team without Cam Rising there at quarterback. We all know that, but man, it really reared its head here this past week. I just am flabbergasted by what they're doing offensively right now. They went for it on 4th down. They had to 4 different times against Arizona. They were 0 for 4. They got in the red zone 2 times and had 0 points to come out of it. They have got some issues there at quarterback. They need Cam Rising back, and who knows when and if we're going to see him. I mean, last year, Cam Rising sat out the entire year, as we know, with an injury. But even then, it was like he might play this season at some point. Utah is the king of the cloak and dagger of whether or not a player is going to play. They got that thing on lock. And until we see Cam Rising do more than just warm up before games and actually go out there and play, Utah is nowhere near the type of team they can be. But when Cam Rising's out there, they're going to be a top 15 team, maybe a playoff contender even after this loss. So until then, I'm going with what they got on the field now. In addition to the result this past week, they fall 16 spots in my rankings this week and barely hold on the top 25.
I totally agree with you. Side note before we dive into Utah, we need to start getting injury reports and holding teams accountable for stuff like this. And it's not anything personal against Kyle Whittingham, but they are famously known for not giving you any information. Not even the broadcast crews that are calling the game. You find out when they're under center, and they get very coy with it, and they use it for a competitive advantage. When we're supposed to be coming like the NFL, some conferences are requiring you to put them out there. We need to hold them accountable. That aside, Brandon is 100% right. Isaac Wilson, there was a massive drop-off. Last year, there was a massive drop-off. They were only an 8-win team. And this is a team which, even in the Pac-12, was a perennial contender for the Pac-12 championship. If they get Cam Rising, and he's the version that we saw a year and a half ago, which is going back a long time ago, since he's played meaningful snaps, then yes, I think they're the favorite to win the Big 12. Without them, they are middle of the pack in the Big 12, which is a competitive conference as it gets from top to bottom, which makes me look at them again like probably an 8-win team, because they can overcome things defensively with the run game, but they are limited at quarterback without Cam Rising.
I just know he's going to redshirt, and we're going to see Cam Rising playing football again next year. Oh my gosh, get this man out of the college ranks. Danny Kanell, Brandon Marcello breaking down Brandon's latest power rankings after week 6. Are we in week 6 going into week 6?
Going into week 6. It's crazy.
Time is flying by. Well, listen, you heard Danny tease the Cover 3 podcast. He just hopped off recording that episode. Indiana as a potential playoff team. You'll have to listen into the latest episode by scanning that QR code on your screen or listening to the Cover 3 pod wherever you get your audio.